So we were delighted when Professor Kathleen Lynch agreed to deliver this year's annual lecture. She is, for those of you who know her, she is an outstanding, passionate and persuasive advocate for equality. And throughout her whole career, she's underpinned her arguments with rigorous analysis and research. As a society, we desperately need both this passion and the rigour. Too little attention has been paid to the role played by inequality in our economic crisis. And too little attention is now being paid to the role which equality should and could make to our economic recovery. Too often, serious discussion about equality is replaced with talk about fairness. And yet, as you will hear from Kathleen tonight, this evening, fairness is not defined clearly in law or in politics. Instead, Kathleen will point out what is fair and what is unfair is defined by those in power. And that's why TASC argues that we need to replace the nebulous concept of fairness with the far more robust term of equality. So I'm really looking forward very much to listening to Kathleen's lecture on this theme tonight. Professor John Horgan is our chair for the evening. John has had a number of illustrious careers by now. He has been a politician, a journalist, a writer, and an academic. And still breaking new ground, he is now Ireland's first press ombudsman. So we are very privileged that he has agreed to chair this evening's event.
I must say I am honoured, more than I can say, to be asked to chair this meeting and to introduce Kathleen Lynch to you. As most of you will know, Kathleen is the Professor of Equality Studies at University College Dublin. She's also an advisor to the EU Directorate and a member of the European Network of Experts in the Social Sciences, among many other distinguished characteristics. She's published widely in the field of education, and she's deeply committed to equality and social justice, particularly in this particular field. In fact, I was thinking when I was looking over Kathleen's CV and the more detailed aspects of it, that in all my various careers, education has been a sort of common thread, and one which has from time to time addressed issues of inequality and equality, although not very effectively and not in anything like the depth that Kathleen and others in her field have managed. I think we're all born into inequality, whether we accept it, resent it, bask in it, but there's much more to equality and inequality than simply recognizing that it exists. There are other stages that are involved, such as the stage when you realize that it's not preordained, that it can be changed. Then there's the stage which involves the recognition of the need to change it. And finally, there's the stage at which you get some grasp of the methodologies and the tools that are needed to change it. And I think all of us are at some stage in that progression, and all of us have probably some way to go. I know that I learned what little I know in the field of education and equality at the feet of a couple of radical Democrats in the field of education, both of them public servants, Sean O'Connor and Bill Hyland. And one of the fascinating things about educational change in this country is that so much of it emanated from the centre and was forced and an unwilling body politic, rather than being a slow reaction by the centre to the demands of Democrats and egalitarians outside. It's sometimes said, and I have to accept that I would bear part of the blame or the responsibility for this about universities, that they are noteworthy for being hotbeds of cold feet. I think Kathleen Lynch is the standing rebuke to people who would say that about universities, and particularly about her own work and that of her colleagues. I have very great pleasure in introducing her to you and look forward very much to hearing what she has to say.
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. What I'm highly amused at actually is I'm lecturing a very long time, And my very first lecture I went to give to the HDIP students in UCD, all 400 of them. I left my notes at home. I was so nervous. Now, I know I was nervous a bit this evening, but I left my notes in the car. But anyhow, I think I know it well enough to speak to the subject. What my title is, From a Neoliberal to an Egalitarian State, Imagining in a Different Future. And I'll just speak, I think, for about half an hour, and we'll have questions. I think that's the arrangement. And I look forward very much to your questions, because I think sometimes the ideas really only develop in the questions. The audience often has the answers more than the speaker. So this is the outline of what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk about different concepts of equality, and particularly talk about the concept of equality of condition, because this is a concept that we have developed in UCD, and it is very interesting to me, actually, that our book Equality from Theory to Action is being translated into other languages, including Arabic, but I don't think it was ever reviewed in an Irish newspaper, so that is an interesting facet in itself. So I'm going to draw on that book, and then I'm going to talk as well about more recent work that we've done, developing the concept of equality of condition, the notion of intersectionality, and I'm going to talk about the culture of politics that surrounds the debate about equality in Ireland, and the silences and the closures and what I would see as the closing down of political dissent and particularly political difference. I'm also talk about the new conservatism, the ideology of fairness, and what we should do and maybe could do about ideological closures. And I'm also trying to bring in this discussion today debates within feminism into the debates about the care and justice and its relationship to economic and other forms of equality, because I think they're very profound and very significant. And that has been the subject, actually, of our most recent book, and I will draw conclusions. So what I'm saying here is that, I suppose for a start, I do think that this is a time of crisis. And I don't know if any of you attended Habermas's lecture yesterday in UCD, or Tuesday, what I think it was. He actually, one of the major themes of his work is that a time of crisis is also a time of opportunity. There are always cracks in the political regimes, in the economic regimes. There are always places and spaces. And I think for people who are committed to social justice or equality, however you name it, in whatever language you use, it is a time of opportunity. So I think if we're going to talk about it, we have to decide, well, what kind of equality do we want? And most people would agree, and even the most totalitarian and unjust states largely subscribe to basic equality, the idea of people equal in worth and equal entitlement to respect. But the concept that dominates our political discourse in Europe and in Ireland is definitely liberalism. And it varies from the more conservative to more slightly left of centre. But I think it's very important to remember that the focus of liberalism is on regulating competition for advantage. And I will comment on the problem that poses for actually bringing about real political change. So our argument is that we should have equality of condition, because R.H. Tawney wrote a book in the 1930s. He was a professor of political theory in Oxford and did a lot of work with miners. And he used to say that liberal equality was fine. Its credit was good as long as it tried to never cash its checks. It was allowed to reign, provided it never attempted to rule. And I think that is a fundamental political problem in relation to liberal social democratic politics and its understanding of equality. Our view is different. It's about eliminating, not regulating, not redistributing who's around in the hierarchy, major inequalities of wealth, power and privilege, and recognising, as I said here, that it has to happen over time. And I take as an example, if we have a minimum wage, when minimum, then we should think of maximum income and wealth, beyond which you would have, for example, very severe and very punitive income tax. So why would I talk about equality of condition? And why is liberal equality not sufficient? Well, I'm sure many of you know by this stage the work of people like Wilkinson and Pickett, but there is a new book out by Daniel Dorling in Britain on injustice, making a different analysis using different types of data and making the very same claims, showing the empirical evidence that it has very limited impact in education or employment. And why they don't work is, I think, a number of endemic problems. And that is the acceptance of hierarchy at the heart of liberal democratic politics. And I remember once in 1990, actually, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which is 20 years ago now, asked me would I give a lecture on equality. And I raised this question of income and wealth differentials within occupations. And everybody thought it was heresy. But of course, it is because it is ritualized. Differentials, relativities are ritualized. We expect to earn, because we happen to hold a particular standing in society as professors or whatever, more money than somebody who works in the library or somebody who cleans the rooms. And the question is, why should we? What moral right have we, given in fact that many of us who are very well educated have earned our privileges at the behest of taxpayers and indeed our education in particular at their cost? So I think the acceptance of hierarchy, for example, most of the studies in Ireland that are done on equality, and I suppose I have to mention them because there's so many of them done by the ESRI traditionally, focus on social mobility. If we have social mobility, they say we have more equality. Do we? If we have a low-wage economy, which people have no security, pensions, no guaranteed hours of work, flexible only for the employer, and they become migrant workers rather than Irish workers, is that egalitarian? I don't think that changing the faces of the people in positions of privilege, including having a handful of middle-class women in positions of authority, is radically altering anything in society. In many ways, it legitimates injustice. Because, in fact, the people who have to occupy the subordinate positions of powerlessness or pennilessness are left as they were. So it also today, the problem is it doesn't deal with system-based injustices, with capitalism, patriarchy, disablism, racism, homophobia. So it doesn't deal systemically often with the structures that have to change, because, of course, as I said here, there's a lack of attention given as well within it to the public-private divide, and that is a huge feminist question. Most liberal politics, and I get so irritated all the time, real politics is not equated with anything other than what happens in the public sphere. But what happens in the family sphere, in the private sphere of care relations for children, for vulnerable people, whoever they are, we will all be vulnerable, we were or we will be, and probably both. That equality is a fundamental problem there, and it impacts on the public sphere, which I'll come to talk about later on. And the other problem is it focuses on individual rather than group rights. And consequently, when failure is attributed to individuals within that liberal tradition rather than attributed to deep structural injustices. So what I'm saying here is why it matters is because it focuses attention on the intersectionality of injustice, which I'm going to comment on in a moment. Yes, economic inequality is foundational, but if you, for example, are not given respect, even if you are somebody with a reasonable income, I'm not saying that economics, I'm a firm believer in that, but there are many people in society who are not respected. We can think of travellers, for example, in particular, and there is a huge amount of anti-black racism, which is not generated in the economic sphere per se. So we cannot look, and we'll say the anti-black racism, colour-based racism, if I want to call it that, has serious economic consequences for people in terms of employment and in terms of how they experience the public sphere and indeed the private sphere. And also, we think we have to address group-based injustices because, for example, we cannot take class actions in this country, in the legal sphere. We have no mechanism for taking it. And consequently, our laws, our anti-discrimination laws, are built on the premise that what is being protected is individual rights, not group rights. So that is another reason we need an equality of condition perspective. And also because this is about substantive equality and provisions in law, not just anti-discrimination. And I think if we talk about equality of condition, it opens up a dialogue between social democratic thinking, socialism and feminism, and indeed disability studies and other forms of new intellectual thinking around ethnic and racial studies, lesbian and gay studies, etc. It draws attention to the complexities of society. And this is the kind of model that we talk about and use in our work as a way of mapping the scale of injustice and inequality, and also the way in which it generated differently for different groups. It's obvious that the economic system is paramount and that the resources issue is generated there, wealth, income, but also access to good public services often in very unequal societies. And of course, in that upper nexus on the top left-hand corner stands, of course, the big issue of class politics. But it also it impacts across everywhere else. If you take the cultural sphere, respect and recognition, I mentioned this in the paper. If you are poor, you are not just poor. You are called in the media, if you live in certain corporation estates, you're referred to as living in rough areas. You're called scumbags. Your language of derision is applied to you. And when you die, if you die in very violent situations in certain areas, your life is referred to as having been killed in a gangland killing. There is a trivialization of your human worth by virtue of your economic status and your class standing. Equally, of course, the political system, the power, where power is actually enacted, of course it's in parliamentary politics and where political decisions are made. But power, and obviously, for example, I firmly believe that a group who are really subjected to a sense of powerlessness in our society are children. In fact, I would take them as the exemplar case of people who are often exposed to powerlessness, especially given the lack of constitutional standing. But other groups also experience that sense of power. For example, in relation to people like, if you want to take disabled people, who often, for example, won't have public transport in a rural area if you have mobility impairments to actually go to somewhere or even to go to work. So power is not just the prerogative of any one group. And equally, I suppose many people take sexual politics, gay and lesbian, LGBT politics as symbolic of the core issue of respect and recognition, the cultural system. But there are many other groups who are affected by this. Women are often affected by it, but they are also seriously affected by the economic and other systems through the segregation of the labour market. But I would argue, for example, that there is a fourth dimension, as we have argued in our work, on the area of care in the affective domain of life. Because people are not just economic actors, they're not just political actors, they are not just cultural actors, we are also emotional human beings and moral agents. And the deprivation of human care, whether it's in the intimate domain of life or in our work situations where we have no time for a coffee or tea, or whether our work situations have become so perilous that we literally cannot associate, we cannot mix, we are constantly enforced in states of productivity. We are deprived of the right, in my view, to the companionship of others. And so there is often a serious deprivation in our society of the time to be with the other whom we want to be with. And I want to take it because I think it is most serious in relation to migration. There is an assumption at the heart of capitalism that you are a unit of labour. You are a migratory unit of labour, and it doesn't matter where you will go. At the heart of that is the assumption that your personal relationships, your neighbourhood relationships, even your work relationships are trivial in terms of your identity. And in fact, that you do not have a relational life. But people do have relational lives. If they are forced into emigration, as we are doing now to young people, it isn't just the loss to the country. It is the loss to them of the companionship of their friends, their families, and of their families. So I think, and of course, all of that feeds back into other areas of life. You can't look at one of these systems on their own. And I just want to bring us attention here from, this is in the paper, so you don't have to study it if you can't see it. But I just want to talk about, because people often say, oh, women earn less than men, or certain groups, are well or whatever in our society. And this is taken from the SILC data of 2006, which is the study of income and living conditions, Irish data from Europe, right? And what I wanted just to point out here, if we look at the people who are most vulnerable in our society, who are consistently poor, we have here lone parents, right up at the pinnacle, 32.5% of them consistently poor. Yet they are the very group at this moment in our society who are under attack consistently. Disabled people in terms of the services that are being offered to them. And of course, since this was done in 2006, there is a growing number of unemployed people. And we have people who are not homeowners. And children, again, many people, houses headed by women. All I'm saying here is, when we look at inequality and economic inequality, it interfaces with all these other identities. It isn't simply a matter of saying, I am socialist and I am for the working class. Who is the working class? Who are you speaking about, and where is the audience? Because, of course, these groups are disproportionately from low-income backgrounds, but what I want to say is there is an interface between all the identities that impact on people's well-being. So I want to move on from here and to ask about ideology and politics. Ireland is classified internationally as a neoliberal political state. All the classifications, that is how it's classified. And as you know, it remains one of the most economically unequal states in Europe. In the UN Gender Empowerment Index 2010, we're ranked at 80 out of 147 in terms of party representation for women, and I don't want to be racist, but our standing is the same as Cameroon. So that's where we are. Yet what I find amazing, no political party in Ireland is ever defined as conservative or right-wing. Virtually nobody. In fact, I watched the programme, which I found fascinating, on the PDs. And I found it fascinating because the only person throughout the entire programme, I only saw one of them, maybe there was more than one, I don't know. I only saw one, but there are two. I saw one this week, I think it was it? Gareth Fitzgerald. He was the only person who said it was a right-wing party. And I found that fascinating, how an entire hour of public discourse could go on that wasn't named. But the other mainstream parties, they never claim conservatism, yet I'm saying they are classified outside of the state as conservative. And no party claims feminism. In fact, I went on the websites today to do a check in case I was wrong, in case there had been a revolution since I was last here, as it were. So I'm just saying, so yet, ironically, and this is ironic, the last social science survey in Ireland shows, at least at the level of rhetoric, Irish people, much more so than British people, for example, hold quite strong egalitarian views. So you have to ask, is there a disjuncture between what we declare in politics and actually what people actually subscribe to? And what I think has happened is the populism and consensualism is a cloak for political conservatism. There is no doubt about it that Irish public policy has been favouring the wealthy and the middle classes, not just for the last 13 years, but for many generations. Tax, pensions, tax relief on private insurance for health, tax relief on your pensions. The more money you have, the bigger your tax relief. Property supplements, subsidisation of mortgages. Education, the failure to do anything about kind of serious inequalities in education. And in my view, as I have tried on many occasions to get, we still do not have national statistics by social class on the junior cert and the leaving cert. And that is not accidental. We have put in 3 different proposals, various groups of academics, to study this issue. And one would have to suspect that there is a foreclosure, there is a closure of around the question, because it does not want to be brought into the public domain. And Irish public policy has completely and consistently ignored the question of public childcare. And what I'm only saying, as I see here from the outside looking in when I was asked to comment on this, that party politics and party survival seems to have become the preoccupation, even as I listened on the radio. Of course there are concessions, but the language of, you have the caring conservatives in Britain, that's what the conservatives were calling themselves. Bush at one time talked about his compassionate politics. So I'm just saying, and people talk about the common man, sorry, note my emphasis, and the plain people of Ireland. But this is all a charade. It's an intellectual charade that is very rarely called to account in the public sphere. And I think it now has led on to this populism, this denial of the deep ideologies and the fail to name to this new conservatism, the ideology of fairness. It's in Britain, it's in the United States in particular, it is very much an Anglo kind of ideology. And the reason I mention it is because all the parties are using it. virtually all. It's not a robust theoretical or legal concept because it's not defined legally. In fact, I even contacted a very eminent professor of law I know in the United States who happened to be a Marie Curie fellow with us for this term and asked her to check it. She said, and I think it's very important, what is fair is defined by people who are in power. It is entirely subjective, and it makes it because it depends on what you and I think it to be. And it also, for example, in economics often, is equated with what's called the equalization of envy, that no one prefers the bundle of goods allocated to another above her or his own. And therefore, I'm saying that fairness cannot be singular guiding principle in policy, as it's unworkable because we don't know what it is, it's highly subjective, and it's open to abuse by those in power, and it's morally suspect, as the envy of the rich has the same moral standing as the envy of the destitute. So what I'm saying is that is a move to the right in Ireland, in Irish public discourse. And it has happened everywhere. It's like the move from, although we resisted it, I think, reasonably well in higher education in this country, to call our students customers. It is an outrageous suggestion that a human right granted to you on the UN Convention would actually be translated into a market principle. And yet many of those changes have occurred without a wink, without any debate. And one would have to say we are ideologically at that level asleep and intellectually asleep within the country. I think the problem is that there are many myths and misunderstandings, and many of them stem from myths about socialism, it's about feminism, egalitarianism, and it's not surprising. But I have taught, as I have said, in many years, and I'll be teaching undergraduates in UCD. I also taught in the community sector, and I even did some teaching for experience in the second level sector. I will have to say, I have virtually never met somebody who could define what socialism means. Give me one paragraph on it that is coherent and consistent. We won't go to feminism, because it is, except for those who are in the inside tracks of both. And that, I think, is a serious political problem, because when we talk about other countries, particularly about Scandinavia, for example, which I have a lot of links both in research and in policy, and I work a lot with both Finland and Sweden, many of those countries, their radical thinking, they may call it social democratic, and of course it is, but it has its roots also in socialism, in feminism. And often the debates internally are translated into that language. And I think we need to reclaim it here in the public sphere and not to be afraid. As I said in the paper, people are afraid of the words. They're afraid of the label, as if it will consign you to history politically or indeed occupationally. And I think their problem, in fact, John and I were talking beforehand, there are many reasons, I think, for it. One is the no social scientific education in Irish schools. I was party to a number of people in the mid-1980s trying to get sociology, politics, philosophy, such subjects approved. We ran completely into the sand. We got no support. We did get CSPE, which was some improvement, I suppose, but everyone knows it's only 1 or 2 hours a week. It's a tiny syllabus. It's not really supported, and it's not resourced. And I know there's plans to have something at upper secondary level, but really and truly, how can we have an informed electorate with critical views if nobody has the nomenclature to name the word? It doesn't even exist in higher education, as I said here. Marketisation threatens all critical disciplines. Every department now, I mention here the various studies, development studies, ourselves, women's studies, disability studies, we're all under threat. We are supposed to be market-led. How can the education of people about social justice and equality issues or women's issues be totally marketable, given that the people often who want to do those courses have no money? And I think it is the social sciences themselves have actually moved away often from critical thought, and I think it is also to do with the pressure to be marketable. And in the community and adult education sector, for example, as you probably know if you're involved in it, there are major threats to community education. What's being sold is, oh, you must have something that supplies you with skills. Skills, yes, I don't doubt their importance, But where is the critical analysis? The threat, for example, to the community development programs that's going on at the moment isn't just a threat to those programs, it's a threat to civil society, and it's also a threat to the civil and social education that goes on within them at local level. It's a very real intellectual threat, not just, and I think that is part of the reason, quite frankly, that they are being closed down. It isn't just for the work that they do, that they think they can dismiss them, but they have raised organic intellectuals in their own communities that have fought and brought and articulated to those in power the views of those of local level because they have educated them to speak. And also, of course, there is the media. And this is something that I've written a few paragraphs on in the paper. It fascinates me in the media. I often read the papers, listen to various programs, and of course there are political programs and that of the media. But I wanted to comment on the print media. We have every week I pick up the Irish Times, which has, as you know, kind of review section. And over the years I have found that large focus is literature and the arts, history and politics a little bit. We even have a section, today's paper, there's the arts page and the sciences page. But there's nothing in the critical social sciences, absolutely nothing. And in fact, it's fascinating. There have been multiple publications in the social sciences and in education, none of which have ever been reviewed in an Irish newspaper. And I think that that is another reason. And I'm not saying I don't doubt the importance of literature in Ireland, but Kathleen O'Neill isn't here, but she won't mind me saying this, I'm sure. She's an activist in North Dublin and Kilbarrack in community development. And one time she was offered a place to do her degree in literature in the English department in UCD, and she thought of coming to us in equality studies. And I said, well, if you want to do it, do it. But I said, I think this whole emphasis in Ireland, in the cultural sphere, on literature is very important, but it is often at the price of critical analysis. We do not have an emphasis on it. In philosophy, we don't have it. We have no Marxist philosophers in the country that I know of. We have no feminist economists. We have no dissent, and that is a problem as well within the universities, not just within the media. So what I'm saying is the mind is a site of political struggle, and I suppose that we have to take ownership of the fact at the political level that there is no view from nowhere. All parties have ideologies. And I look forward to the media actually asking people what they believe rather than what suit they're wearing or what is their personality that's going to please people, and the visuals on the media. And certainly I believe we need systematic critical education. Systematic. No, and in fact, that is the problem from primary to tertiary level about our social systems, our political structures, our legal and economic systems. And for example, the media itself needs to be analysed. One of the things that strike me is I have never seen a programme on the media, on television and RT, where somebody is actually analysing and critiquing the media itself. What does it do? Who is it? Like, sometimes it's so obvious that it is so partisan, but like there is no reflexivity, there is no reflecting back on the self. And yet, I think it plays a huge role in determining political agendas and indeed in isolating political debates and certainly political dissent. I also think that there needs to be substantial research funding for critical analytical thinking in Ireland. I'm on the Irish Research Council for the Humanities and Social Sciences. A few years ago I asked, I'm only recently appointed, I asked for data indicating how much money was allocated to research in the humanities and social sciences and comparative figures for Europe. I was given it orally rather than writing. We gave less than 1%. Now I would say it's less than 0.5% of research funding to that area. The nearest comparator to us in Europe at the time was Britain at 7%. So when people complain that there often are no ideas, or first of all, then the ideas that are produced are not brought into the public sphere. Maybe that's the fault of academics. But it's also, I think, the relationship between the academy and the media, and that's a big issue. But it's also the fact that all the funding I have got, and I have been involved in getting funding all my life, most of it has come either some from education, but via Europe. Most recently, our major funding is all from Europe, because there is nothing to apply for in Ireland if you are a critical social scientist. And I think that is very serious. Because it's like Microsoft, people say, why don't we produce ideas? Ideas cost money. You know, Intel, Microsoft, Pfizer's are not going out producing ideas on fresh air. They pay people to produce them. And it's very interesting that Science Foundation of Ireland, for example, gave the designation of certain areas of economics as science. Because, of course, then they could be part of the gravy train that is in that field. I'm not saying they have vast amounts of money, but relative to the rest of us who are in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, they have. So I think there is a very serious question there. But I want to go on to something slightly different, if I may, towards the end of my talk, and to come back to theory, and to talk about the interface between political egalitarian theory and effective equality. The debates in politics are largely between redistribution and recognition. It has been central to liberal politics. You know, the protection of rights, the protection of minorities, etc. And on the one hand, the recognition issue and the redistribution issue on the other. And analysis exploitation is focused on what we sometimes call the Marxist-Weberian trilogy, class, status, and power. But people are not just autonomous beings, as we have found out to our cost when we pay for very heavily at the moment for our banks. We are highly interdependent people. We are highly relational. And at times, therefore, this has enormous implications, not just for our economic well-being, but for our personal and political well-being. And I would argue that people experience also affective inequality when they are either deprived of love, care, and solidarity they need. And I talk about, for example, I can't go into it now, but if you question me, I will explain what I mean by some of these terms and the differences. And when people are also carry an unequal burden of care work, and of course, as we know, in the latter case, that is disproportionately women. But what I'm saying here is that social and political science, insofar as it informs public debate at all, generally assumes that social actors are interest-led. People always say to you, if you're in politics, it's only power, status, and money that matters. People are utility-maximizing individuals. Well, they are. But there is growing evidence internationally that people are not exclusively utility-maximizing individuals economically. They have what we now call lay normativity. There is actually an interface of interest that isn't entirely, if you like, economic-centered interest or even power-related interests. Because human beings, and the problem we have here is the influence of Cartesian rationalism on our concept of the citizen, if I may be academic about it. Because A, it assumes that we are cerebral, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It assumes that rationality is divorced from feeling. And of course, it also assumes that people are autonomous, that we are not relational. But we have found in our research, fairly extensive research on care work, that people often, in practice, prioritize relationships over money. And men and women do it. Women do it more than men, but men do it too. Because human beings are also evaluative as well as interest-led. And they evaluate their own actions in terms of norms and values, not just in terms of economic gain. And so what I'm saying here is that human vulnerability, which I think is at the heart of the human condition, rather than our utility maximization that economists would have us believe, lie at the base of both personal and political morality. And yet, we don't call that into the public sphere. In the political debates, we don't articulate it in a sustained way that we can actually bring people with us. Maybe, I think there are people trying to do it at the moment, but I think it would create a very different politics. So what I'm saying is, yes, we need in Ireland to get out from the ideological illusions that there are no ideologies. We need to start thinking critically, but also carefully. But it is, as I said here, Ireland is not just an unequal society economically and indeed in terms of power and privilege. It is also what I would call a careless society. The way it treats people when they are sick, prioritization of those who have money over those who need to be cared for, must be the best example of carelessness. And I'm saying the legacy of the public-private divide, which is at the heart of liberal democratic thought, is the neglect of the care domains of life. I think it has serious implications for gender justice, but also for children and for other vulnerable peoples. So what I'm saying here is that we need to endorse a model of equality of condition rather than a liberal equality model. If we're supposed to want to support substantive as opposed to formal equality, and if we ensure that injustices in all the social systems are addressed, not just one of them, not just those that are politically convenient for my particular group. And we need to overcome the silences that govern political parties and political ideologies. And in fact, I think we need to reclaim the left, the language of feminism, the language of socialism, the language of egalitarianism, whatever we use, but we need to claim it. Because if we don't, what happens is the ideological space is left empty for more conservative forces in society to claim it. And I think certainly the move to fairness, which is entirely generated originally in the neoliberal camp in terms of the history of ideas, it is amazing to see many people who would themselves, I'd say, define themselves as left using that language. And that's what I mean about closing down the political space when we don't create our own spaces. Having said that, I do think it's very important not to let nomenclature divide us. I think that is a big mistake those of us who are interested in equality have made in Ireland. I firmly believe, no matter what our persuasion, we have to try and work for a better and more equal society. Thank you very much.